Good evening, my friends. This is the Grim Flayer. Hope you're doing very well tonight. And hey, a very Merry Christmas to you. And may I also add Go Yule to you, because we are visiting the realm of Kaldheim for the first spoiler coverage on this channel featuring Sarulf Realm Eater. Now, I'm aware of a few things. Number one, I'm probably butchering pronunciations of Sarulf and maybe of Goyul as well, so Scandinavian viewers, please do feel free to take me to task in the comments below. Number two, I'm well aware that I'm a little bit late to the party on spoiler coverage here. What can I say? This time of year absolutely is my busiest by far, so better late than never, am I right? And number three, I'm well aware that this card is probably a little bit too cute overall to be a mainstay in modern decks, even in ones where it does have some synergies and does slot in pretty well. But nevertheless, for the sake of completion, for the sake of coolness, and also because it is a really unique card with a couple of really strong effects, we will cover the question, Sarulf Realm Eater, will it rock? Thank you so much for watching. Let's dive right in. Sarulf Realm Eater is one generic, one black, and one green for a 3/3 legendary wolf. We love it already. Whenever a permanent an opponent controls is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on Sarulf. At the beginning of your upkeep, if Zarolf has one or more +1/+1 counters on it, you may remove all of them. If you do, exile each other non-land permanent with converted mana cost less than or equal to the number of counters removed this way. So, just briefly before we break down the text, look at this art. I love the name, love the art. The framing is amazing on this promo. Sometimes the promo framings are cool, sometimes they're not so cool. This is all subjective, of course. This one absolutely crushes it. Huge fan of it. And yes, I am predisposed toward liking Kaldheim, setting, theme, etc. in general, so I freely acknowledge my bias. I want Sarulf to rock. I want this card to be really good. Of course, as a mythological reference, we're calling back to Fenrir here very strongly. So lots and lots to like aesthetically, but make no mistake, there's lots and lots to like on that text box. We have, first of all, to acknowledge that any kind of an exile effect that is even remotely modern playable is very hard to come by, if not entirely non-existent in the green-black colors, and that also extends to green-black-red, so even if we dip into Jund, the addition of the color red not exactly helping us exile creatures now, is it? And against recursive graveyard-related threats or strategies, or even threats that just have the keyword indestructible, we have all been between a rock and a hard place, no pun intended, when we have a handful of kill spells and we still can't deal with their threat permanently or at all. Sarulf not only enables us the ability to exile threats, it also enables us to exile all other threats repeatedly. Now, of course, this does take a lot of setup. That is a bit of a stars aligning moment. We do have to rein in expectations. But one of the reasons I wish to cover this card is simply how high of a ceiling and how of a unique of an effect that is. If we have a card that is at least in some ways pushed, and it does something that nothing else we have access to can do, and it has an enormously high power ceiling, it at least merits investigation, it might merit testing, and it might merit just keeping in mind, keeping on maybe board lists, and maybe keeping in your binder just in case we do finally get cards that push it over the top into viability if it is not already viable. But I do wish to really stress the power of that specific section of text that I'll read one more time. At the beginning of your upkeep, if Zarolf has counters on it, you may remove all of them. If you do, exile each other non-land permanent with CMC less than or equal to the number of counters removed this way. Having established that, there is actually another way in which Sarulf has a very high ceiling, and that is in the simple but beloved role of Big Dumb Beater. Note that the text I just read you about removing the counters and exiling other non-land permanents is a may. So if you have too many valuable low-curve permanents and or your opponent's board doesn't have permanents that you need to exile, you get to leave the counters on Sarulf and you get to take him to beat down town. Now, I don't want to get it twisted. I don't want to oversell it. This is not a Tarmogoyf. This is not a Scourge of the Skyclaves. It is not as efficient, costing one more, and it is not likely to be as big, especially in the early turns as those cards are. However, it does have a higher ceiling in that role than both of them. We've all had our Tarmogoyf be 0-1 under a Rest in Peace, and we have all, probably those of us who have played enough games since ZNR came out, have had Scourge of the Skyclaves rotting in hand, unable to be cast because one or both players is at 20 or more life, or even worse, life gain results in the Scourges dying on the spot. This does not happen to Sarulf. It is a 3-3 as a floor, so it doesn't have maybe as high of an efficiency grade in that role, but it technically has a higher ceiling, right? Or maybe as high of a ceiling, realistically speaking. It has a much higher floor. That said, the floor still isn't that great. A 3-3 for 3 notoriously does fail the bolt test, doesn't have any forms of protection, it gets pushed, it gets decayed, etc., etc. But it is definitely a realistic beater, and you can just imagine how nice it would be to get Zarolf down, untap with it, kill an opponent's threat, wipe the board of the others, or if they don't have enough others to worry about, to get to go 4-4, 5-5, 6-6, whatever it's going to be, start attacking. And let's look back when we're talking about how big this card can get at the first line of text. Whenever a permanent an opponent controls is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, put a counter on Sarulf. So, of course, their own fetch lands notoriously being cracked, will grow Sarulf. There's definitely a lot of ways in which this card can get big. Between the uniqueness of the max exile effect and the high ceiling of said effect, and also the high ceiling but difficult to quantify role of Sarulf as a beater, whether or not the exile effect is lining up, I think this card, more than many cards, will need to be tested in order to be fully understood. And I think the community's reaction to this card is reflective of that, because a lot of people whose takes I value really highly are pretty convinced that this card's going to see some play in Rock and or in Jund, whereas probably a larger percentage of people are just as convinced that it is just a little too cute, needs a little bit too much setup, just maybe not good enough, right? And then there are others, of course, remaining agnostic, but the point is there's not very much of a consensus that I've been able to see, and therefore, again, another point in favor of testing the Realm Eater. Okay, so what cards do synergize with Zarolf? Well, that's the good news. It's kind of everything we want to do already. Your pushes, your bolts, your Blood Chief's Thirsts. I select these cards specifically because they are cards that A, put the opposing threats into the graveyard, and B, are CMC1, because some of the time at least, we're going to want to treat Sarulf like a tireless tracker, in that even though it is a 3-drop, in practice we'll make it a 4-drop so you can play it, get some more or less guaranteed value by following it up with the 4th land drop. We're not getting value off the landfall, of course, we're getting value off being able to double spell, immediately put a counter on, maybe getting our own Sarulf out of the opposing bolt range, for instance, or at the very least getting our counter ready to roll by the time our next upkeep comes around. Another card to mention is Trophy, because even if the opponent is not presenting creatures to kill, you can still point a trophy at a land, or indeed at any other permanent, right? And then you can therefore grow Zarolf in that manner. But all this stuff, is the juice really worth the squeeze? Are we not just better off, like playing our normal threats, attacking with Goyfs, drawing cards while pressuring with Bob, and killing things as they come up? Maybe. But the point is, if Sarulf is playable in Modern, it's probably going to be in a deck like ours, because again, all the things we're doing naturally will grow it. But if we tab back over to the Legendary Wolf itself, we're looking at, again, a card that needs a little bit of setup, even when we have the efficient kill spells I just showed you in hand. So can we do any better in terms of synergy with kill spells? Well, I think we can. How about the seals? We've got Seal of Fire from Nemesis, and Seal of Doom also from Nemesis. Seal of Fire being brought back into the spotlight in Modern thanks to Lurrus, and it has a really good synergy with Sarulf too, because you play it on turn 1 or turn 2, then you can cast the Wolf on curve, you can seal the opponent's threat. Sarulf is, again, immediately a 4/4, maybe out of the opponent's bolt range, if they are tapped out, of course, and also able to exile opposing 1-drops or 0-drops even against certain decks when we go to our next upkeep. That is a really nice synergy. Seal of Doom. Not as powerful as Seal of Fire, not really seeing play even in Lurrus decks. I mention it here for the sake of completion. It is kind of cool, though. You know, you could play Seal on turn 3. If the game is going long, maybe you find a spot for Zarolf on turn 4, turn 5, you can immediately seal something. Both of these cards grow the Goyf. Of course, Seal of Fire, much more broadly playable, but Seal of Doom does exist as well. Seal of Primordium is a card that has seen a bit of sideboard play. Again, Lurrus really bringing this back into vogue, but it is another card that could definitely see some play alongside Sarulf. Remember, again, if we tab back over to the Wolf, it is whenever a permanent an opponent controls, not simply a creature. So using this naturalize effect on their artifacts and on their enchantments plays into Sarulf's paws very nicely. And finally, do not forget that the card Slaughter Pack exists. It is definitely one that has seen play in the Rock before. It's really good alongside Kalitas, for example, just because you can immediately get that value off of Kalitas. You get the exile replacement effect. You make the zombie without having to untap. Same idea here. Consider also that the opponent will definitely generate value for Sarulf on our behalf as they go about their normal gameplay a lot of the time. Again, this is contingent, of course, upon Sarulf surviving, but we are a discard deck. We do play a lot of threats in a normal Rock or Jund build that are must-kills, so it is not entirely unrealistic for our Wolf to survive. And as the opponent cracks their fetch lands, Sarulf will get counters. As they play the legendary Elder Giants like Uro or Kroxa, Zarolf will get counters, and realize that while that in and of itself is not stronger than Uro or Kroxa, you can exile these things even after they've escaped as well. It's not perhaps terribly difficult to realize that we can get there to 3 counters, or even only to 2 counters in the case of an opposing Kroxa, so very much just another reason the exile effects broadly are good. If the opponent is on a Lurrus deck or otherwise playing cards like Mishra's Bauble, other things they like to loop with Lurrus definitely can punish them with Sarulf, and as they just go digging against our mid-range deck with Canopy lands, that will get counters on the Wolf as well. The synergies abound, my friends. Here are a few more. Field of Ruin and Ghost Quarter, 2 lands that are right along the plan with what Rock normally wants to do, and also, incidentally, get those counters on Sarulf by putting permanents into the graveyard. Another one here is a Llanowar Reborn, a little bit less normal, in fact, very, very unlikely to be seen in any kind of normal Rock list. But you know what's not the worst? We do play some threats that eventually the idea is to attack over the line with, and hey, +1/+1 counter, never heard anybody trying to do that, right? But of course, the idea here is you get Llanowar Reborn down T1 or T2. You can play Sarulf on curve, and just like a Slaughter Pact would enable you, or a Seal of Fire, you can get that counter right away. And in fact, it is less conditional than those other cards, so that is very exciting. By the way, the ideas I'm presenting here, some of them came from myself, others come from various sources, including the great people of my Discord. I can't credit you all, but thanks to everybody who did throw some really cool ideas into the mix here. Finally, Inscription of Abundance. This is a card that a lot of people were excited about when it came out for the Rock. I was a little bit more skeptical. Hasn't really caught on, but it definitely does have a lot of things to like. And in terms of pairing well with Sarulf, well, this definitely does. If you can kick it, And I realize we're getting into win more territory, but if you can kick it, it's completely incredible in every way alongside Sarulf. But even if you're only playing it like turn 4 double spelling after having stuck a Sarulf, or turn 5 in a grindy game when you're picking your spot with Sarulf, you can fight something if Sarulf is inherently bigger. You can get a counter that way, or you can just put the counter straight up on Sarulf and then exile all the 0/1 in 2 drops. It's definitely got some real upsides and some real flexibility, I might add. And here's an idea. What do you guys think about this warband? We've got 3 legends, Sarulf Realm Eater, Kalitas Trader of Get, and Chevelle Bane of Monsters, all of whom actively want you to kill everything that moves. You have many different ways to take over the game just by pointing removal spells at creatures, or in the case of Sarulf, at other permanents, and that is exactly what we want to do anyway in this archetype. I realize that Chevelle and Kalitas are relatively fringe cards by modern standards, but it would be a really fun way to do things. Obviously not the most competitive, though, relative to an open field, but especially because Sarulf is likelier than not to exile Chevelle at some point against a go-wide opponent. Out of necessity, but I also include Tarmogoyf here just for the sake of completion, because in some ways this does work at odds with our usual suspects like Goyf and Skooz. If we are exiling everything with Sarulf, Goyf might not grow, Skooz might not have enough fuel, and also these days Rock is a lower and lower curve and in some ways more threat-dense deck, right? We're playing Hex Drinker, at least I am, almost all the time I register the deck. Goyf, Skooz, Bob, these are all low-curve threats. They're not exactly the most synergistic with Sarulf, so the question will become, if Sarulf is playable, will it be incumbent upon us to build around it a little bit and to reward ourselves with other choices alongside Sarulf for killing a lot of things and or play a lower threat count and or a higher curve? Or should we stick with the tried and true Goyf, Skooz, Bob, Hex Drinker core and have Sarulf as a bit of a curve topper, offering a way to take the game in a few different directions based on what exactly is going on around it? I don't know. These are just things I'm bringing to your attention, things to think about, things to brew around, and things to keep in mind when you do eventually start testing the card. Well, guys, there you go. That is my first look at Sarulf Realm Eater. To sum up, will it rock? I would say probably not, but I would also say that the upsides of the card are such high ceiling and so unique that it does merit testing. We should not dismiss the card without having tested it or without having given it room to breathe, given ourselves time to figure out the best synergies, the best decks in which it slots into, etc., etc. That said, it certainly faces stiff competition. It is a vulnerable 3-drop with no protection effects. It does die to Lightning Bolt, and it does also, in many ways, despite it working right along the plan that we want to be on Rock and Jund, it also is a little bit counterintuitive, specifically with how those decks have trended lately. Again, I emphasize the threat density, the low curve. Sarulf wants us to be like a mid-range control deck. Wants us to play higher curve things, wants us to sit back, kill everything that moves, eventually stick a Sarulf and continue killing everything that moves. That play pattern is probably less realistic than it has ever been in Modern. So, that said, if Sarulf is going to rock, it might be just as something different. It might be not so much of a build around, not warping your deck around the idea of taking over with Sarulf every single game, but more along the lines of, okay, this is a really unique exile effect, really well positioned in certain metas or against certain decks, and can just get big, can just get big kind of like a Tarmogoyf, but in a less efficient but higher floor way. So, much to consider. If nothing else, we have a very cool card to give Ragnarok energy to your trade binder or your MTGO collection, and you can rest assured that I will play it for you at least once on the channel, just to test it and just because it is cool. So once again, Merry Christmas, Gu Yule, and Go Yule? I think it's that. I don't know. And thank you so much for watching my rambling preview and analysis of Sarulf Realm Eater. And hey, as always, my friends, leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you've got some spicy takes, some hot takes, you know you want to archive them here for posterity. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you for the next video, and look forward to more Kaldheim spoilers as we get more of them to cover.